Okay, great. All right. Since we had a week off, so I figured so that gave me a chance to think about where we're up to and we're going. I thought I'd take a step back for a moment, since anyway we've broken the Retzef and talk about something a little more on the news these days. Right? There's basically two things that are in the news these days that are relevant to the beginning of our Masechet. One is the Mishum Aguna Hilu Rabbanon. Right? It's because of Aguna Day. We talked a little bit about that regarding Eidei Chanem and Bisur, and the second one is the Gvulot of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, since at least two of the three places that are in the news appear in the first Mishnah. So I thought since we've been talking a lot about what does it get and how does it get work and how many witnesses do you need and what qualifies and what changes it, etc. And how does the the flow and do you need a flow or do you need what's v'katav la and what's v'chatam la, it's v'katav v'chatam Rabbi Meir and Eidei Chatima Karti. I thought we'd go back to the Mishnah for a moment for today and talk about again Mishnah. Maybe get Medina Tayam, Tzarech Shemer Fran Nachtam Fran Nachtam, right? From Gamliel Omer Afmina Rekam Mina Cheger, but let's remember Afilu Mikfar Ludim Lelod. V'chamer Menot Tzarech Shemer Fran Nachtam Nachtam. Ela maybe Medina Tayam, v'hamolich, which is from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. Maybe Medina Tayam. Sorry, I made a mistake here. I made it wrong. V'hamolich, maybe Medina Tayam, Tzarech Shemer Fran Nachtam Fran Nachtam. So even from one place to another, one environment to another. Rabbi Yehuda Omer mirekem lemizrach rekem kemizrach, mi'ashkelon ledarim v'ashkelon kedarim, mi'akol letzafon v'akol letzafon. And Rabbi Meir Omer akol ke'eretz Yisrael legittin. Okay, so we have this debate since Akko has been in the news, since it's been under attack, and so is Ashkelon, since it's been under attack. Right, so we have some debate here whether these places are considered Eretz Yisrael or not Eretz Yisrael for the purposes of Gittin. Yeah, and this isn't only a technical issue, but it actually relates to some basic issues of how we view Eretz Yisrael. What is Eretz Yisrael, right? So again, when you say B'fanei Nechem, we saw Rabbah and Rava, is it because in Chutz La'aretz they were not particularly versant in the issues of Lishma, or because we didn't know whether they were Eidim there? But either way, whether you say it's a Lishma issue or they say they're Eidim there, the question is, on what basis would we define Eretz Yisrael for the purposes of Gittin? In other words, that's the real question. And I think this Mishnah is somewhat surprising, because the Mishnah seems to indicate that we wouldn't kind of like investigate whether, hey, do they know Lishma, or whether, hey, do they know, are there witnesses that are, accessible? Can we find witnesses that are Mitzuim L'Kaimo? Rather, instead, we kind of use what's called the Gvulot of Eretz Yisrael. And we just ask ourselves, is Ashkelon part of the Gvul of Eretz Yisrael or not part of the Gvul of Eretz Yisrael?
And these places are relatively close geographically. They're not separated by bodies of water. So
right.
Could be learning going back.
Correct. In other words, when you go Ashkelon or you go Akko, in other words, like, what are you saying? Like when you say Akko. So it seemingly, so that's already a surprise. I don't really have it's worth noting. It's not much more than that. But in terms of the definition of Eretz Yisrael, so here already there's significantly more to talk about. And the Rishonim here really do take an opportunity to kind of think about it in its various manifestations. And there's one very, very important and famous distinction that comes up in the Ramban and the Ritva, and maybe even in Tosfot, with their different approaches towards this. And I wanted to kind of take the day to, or maybe next week also, kind of begin exploring that. So again, the Mishnah says, we need to we know in the Gemara it's going to be because of Lishma or because Einin Mitzuim L'Kaimo. Right? Then we know that we got involved in a side discussion for the last 12 weeks about, okay, if it's Lishma, so then, why you need both B'fanei Nechtav and B'fanei Nechtam, and, is Eidei Masir enough? Is it a Ktiva? Whatever. What does V'katav La mean? How much do we give V'katav La? Is it a flow? We got involved in all that stuff. Now we come back to, okay, where do you need B'fanei Nechtav from? And the Mishnah, again, the part that's most important for us today, again, you can follow in the Gemara, you can follow in the sheets. The part that's most important for us is this last line, Ashkelon Kedarom, Vashkelon Kedarom, Yakol Etzafon, Vakol Etzafon. One of the reasons that's important for us is because we know where Akko and Ashkelon are. So it makes it a little easier for us. But is this just a geographical thing? I assume so also. So here, I want to take a step back, where Luchtin always used to say that when you use the Rambam, right, this is like the Brisker thing, you can use the Rambam as an introduction to a sugya, as a commentary in the sugya, or as a psak in the sugya. So you said you have to always review the Rambam 3 times. So I just want to look at one Rambam to start off today, and that's the Rambam in Hilchot Trumot. where the Rambam uses a very interesting language that we're going to compare to Tosfot in just a moment. But the most obvious place to define Eretz Yisrael would be the lands of the laws of Mitzvot Liot Ba'aretz, right? So here the Rambam starts off in Hilchot Truma, a very famous passage that we've read many times here over the last 21 years. Trumot v'Masrot eina noagin min Torah ela b'Eretz Yisrael. Truma and Masrot are only right operative in Eretz Yisrael. Ben b'fnei abayit, ben shelo b'fnei abayit, whether the Beis Hamikdash is standing or not. V'nevim itkiru shiur no god afilu b'Eretz shinar mipnei shu smuch al Eretz Yisrael. Okay, the prophets determined that even cities smuch al Eretz Yisrael smucha, let's say, Jordan, Syria, those places. V'rov Yisrael ochlin sham. The Chachamim Rishonim itkanu, and unlike the Nevi'im, the Chachamim Rishonim itkanu shiur no god af b'Eretz Mitzrayim u'b'Eretz Amon u'Moav. The name she's svivot. So you have three categories here, and with two takanot, right? You have one category of what's defined as Eretz Yisrael. You have a second category of what's defined as smucha Eretz Yisrael. Then you have svivot Eretz Yisrael. Okay, those are three categories that appear in the Rambam. Greg, we started the Mishnah again that talks about where you have to say b'fanei nechtam from, and the Mishnah talks about from places in Eretz Yisrael. And what we're trying to do today, since we took a step back and took a week off, we're going to try to define what Eretz Yisrael is and what the various definitions are. So the Rambam, the most obvious place to look is where the Rambam talks about where the mitzvot atliot ba'aretz are, right? Where the land-based mitzvot are, like Truma and Maaser. And the Rambam defines actually three areas. He defines one that's Eretz Yisrael itself, whether the temple is standing or not. And then he defines two other areas, which are not going to be so important for us, svivot and smuchot and svivot. Okay? Then in law 26, the Rambam says, and this is what's important for us, Hatruma bisman hazeh, Truma today, afilu b'makom shehechziku olei Bavel, and we'll come back to that word in a few minutes. Hechziku means where they establish presence, something like that. String. What? They have shlita, they have chazakah on it, right? They created some sort of chazakah on it. Vafilu b'yemei Ezra. In other words, even when the ones who came back from Bavel, right, in the 530s, and even in the days of Ezra, which is 20 years later, einam mina Torah ela midivrehem. Well, this is somewhat odd, right? This is somewhat strange. The Rambam just said, ben b'fnei abayit, ben b'shlo b'fnei abayit, Truma is no good, no, right? Is Eretz Yisrael. And then the Rambam says that even right, in other words, the places where Yechziku olei Bavel, v'yemei Ezra, einam mina Torah ela midivrehem. She'ein lecha Truma shel Torah Eretz Yisrael bilvad. So that sounds like the places where Ezra and company, right, the Babylonians, when they returned, the Jews who returned from Bavel, came back and were machzik in the land. That wasn't enough to turn it or return it into Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Eretz Yisrael has a biblical definition, and then it has another definition, which Jews were living in these lands after the Babylonian return, and those still were not defined as Eretz Yisrael.
It's not a geographic issue. It's a point-in-time issue.
So it seems like Hechziku Olei Bavel is not enough.
I'm confused. But where were they?
Is that a place?
Came back to
So so look what he says. It would only be in Eretz Yisrael. That seems to be one definition. It needs Eretz Yisrael. Now that is Eretz Yisrael, and it was much of Kol Yisrael Sham, and you need everybody there, right? You need Kol Yisrael Al Admatam. So it doesn't have a definition of. It can have a definition of Eretz Yisrael, but it's still not going to be obligated in the laws of the land, Truma, Maaser, etc., because we didn't have all the Jews back in the land.
Wait, so the second part talks about Zman, but first one Makom.
Right. So apparently it's not just the Makom, that it's not just the geographic space, but you have to take it into a right. Jeff says you have to take it into a context. We're going to try to avoid that one this week as much as we can. But correct. In other words, you need all the Jews here as well.
Bavel or
No. The place where the Babylonians came back to Israel. They came back to Israel. What? Here, Ranana.
Okay.
Olei Bavel came back. They came back to Jerusalem. It's still not biblically oriented. The Jews are back in Israel. They're still not obligated, right? Even though bifnei abayit, shelo bifnei abayit. Once the exile happened, apparently according to the Rambam, the simple reading, once the exile happened, you need two things to happen. One is you need the Jews to come back to Israel and live in Israel, and two, you need all the Jews in Israel. So he says, Yisrael shekol Yisrael admatam. Kol Yisrael admatam. I don't know. Shneimar ki tavo biat kulchem
Don't we have?
right? This, by the way, we studied a lot in the Shemitah issue, if you remember Shemitah, because in Shemitah, that this is Rab Chaim's big reason why today, even though you have most of the Jews here, you haven't had all the Jews here, and therefore Shemitah is only D'Rabbanan. That's why Shemitah is going to continue being D'Rabbanan ad infinitum, right? So again, for the Rambam, there might be Eretz Yisrael today, but there's still not going to, there's going to be an irony. You might have things, right? If we started off today saying the most obvious place to the litmus test for Eretz Yisrael is whether you're going to be chayiv in Truma or Maasrot, it could be that Truma or Maasrot is not a good litmus test at all, because Truma or Maasrot requires something else. It requires Kol or Rov Yisrael Alad Matam, and it requires everybody being here, and therefore, without everybody being here, you're not going to be obligated in the mitzvah Hatlu Adbarat, even though we might find out that Hichziku Ole Bavel, remember that phrase, Hichziku, is enough for other things, right? And then we can start asking ourselves, and this, of course, is where the interesting discussion begins. So, what are the other things? Like, what else do we need Eretz Yisrael for? So, anybody have any suggestions about? So, one is Gittin, right? Okay, 1 day, 2 day Yontif. That's good. Okay, that leads us to a more basic question. The 1 day, 2 day Yontif is an outgrowth of Kiddush HaChodesh, right? No, it's Kiddush HaChodesh, right? When the Jews come back in Bavel, can they be Mekadesh the Chodesh? Right? That's a good question. What are defined? Where would they, again, Jeff says 1 day, 2 days of Yontif, but where would they be Mekadesh the Chodesh? Okay, that's a good question. Okay, Shemitah and Yovel, right? That's again, that would be an outgrowth though of Truma and Meiser, in theory. I mean, again, you could differentiate between different ones, and there is a whole lot of discussion, but for our purposes today. So again, we already have three discussions. I'm going to raise four more, but I think four more. But we already have three things. One, our Mishnah talks about Gittin. Do you have to say B'fanei Nefta if you come from place A to place B? Again, we pointed out that's a surprise, because who cares if it's Eretz Yisrael or not? We should care if they know Lishma or they are Eidim Mitzu and Lakaimo. But the Gemara had to come up with some definition, and it called it Eretz Yisrael. So again, unless you're going to start differentiating, I didn't see anybody who differentiates. We're going to have to use the name of Eretz Yisrael. That being said, and therefore Akko and north is not Eretz Yisrael, and Ashkelon and south is not Eretz Yisrael, right? And okay, so we have Gittin. We have Truma and Maasrot, where we already saw in the Rambam that even if we have this threshold of Hichziku Ole Bavel, it's once Jews were kicked out, when they came back in, you have Hichziku Ole Bavel, that really would create something, but it's not enough without Rov Yisrael Al Matan. Okay, so Truma and Maasrot would be in a definition. Then we have Kiddush HaChodesh, Pruzbol might be a thing, right? That's part of Shemitah, I think. Okay, here, let me give you some more obtuse ones. Yafeh, that's good. How about, we'll just call it Irani Dachat. Right? In other words, can you have an Irani Dachat? Irani Dachat, right, is a city that's fully Avodah Zarah. If you have one in Bombay, you don't have to destroy the whole city, but you have one in Eretz Yisrael, you do have to destroy it. Right? So Irani Dachat would be a good place. That's a good place to measure it. Where else? Milchemet Mitzvah, in other words, do you have a responsibility to fight outside of the land of Israel? That's a good place to measure it. Here's some other obtuse ones. Apar Helam Davar Shel Tzibur. You know what that is? There's a communal. If most of the Jews sin based on a decision of the court, then there's a special korban that's brought. That's all Masechet Horayot, right? That is only brought, first couple chapters. That is only brought if you have more than 51% of the Jews in Israel. How are we going to define Israel? Are we going to define it by Ichziku Ole Bavel? It does not exist anymore, even if we build a temple again, because most of the Jews are not here. That would be a place to test it. And again, we could say there, and we have to think. What we want to do is think about, are the parameters going to be the same? How about this one? This is my favorite one. We're going to discuss this today. How about the prohibition, Ketubot Daf Kuf Chaf, about leaving Eretz Yisrael? You're not ever allowed to leave Israel, except to marry, to get married, or to learn Torah, or for Parnas, right? You're not allowed to leave Israel. Right? That's why they say the Rava, right? The Lubavitch Rebbe didn't come to Israel because he didn't want to leave Israel, right? They'd like to say the Rabbi Soloveitchik didn't come to Israel, but he did come to Israel in 1935, and he left. But right. So does that apply? And where does it apply? Are you not allowed to leave the borders of Ashkelon, right? Except for Milchemet Mitzvah, maybe, or whatever, right? So those are right. Those are questions. And one last one, just because you know this already, but we're going to see it inside today. What about all those rabbis who would kiss the ground when they got to Israel, or roll in the ground when they left Israel, right? Does that apply only, would the same rules apply? Would the definition of Eretz Yisrael be the same definition for all these spaces? So that's what I That's what I want to explore. And the people who bring it up the most are really the Tosfot, because the Tosfot starts off and says, right, this is the next text on the page in front of you after the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Ashkelon Kedarom, and we're going to spend some time on this Tosfot, but what's really interesting is the continuation of the Tosfot. Okay, Tosfot, there was the second half of the Tosfot. Tosfot says, Hiksher Rabbeinu Tam. So here we are now in the end of the 11th century, the beginning of the 12th century, and here's Rabbeinu Tam living in Germany, and he says, wait a second. Hiksher Rabbeinu Tam, the Ashkelon Meretz Yisrael, he says, what are you talking about? How can you say Ashkelon is considered Darom? Now, me and you know Ashkelon is considered Darom, but Ashkelon is considered south of Eretz Yisrael, right? That's what the Mishnah says, right? Not included Eretz Yisrael. So says Tosfot, what are you talking about? There are psukim in Navi that say Joshua conquered Ashkelon, right? It says in Joshua chapter 13, Zot ha'aretz hanisheret ha'ashdodi Ashkeloni, etc. Right? V'chtivi pila Yisrael anachala kasher tziviticha ve'achar kach lachdua kedechtua v'chtu v'shoftim v'kol Yudat azav et Ashkelon v'et pula. Okay, for that enough. I was here, right? That was enough. So if you just take the Tanakh here, I'm sorry I don't have this in front of you, but I'm just going to read you the book of Shoftim, chapter 1, verse 18. You can just share with me, Dov. I apologize that I don't have this in front of you, but chapter 1, verse 18 talks about, and this is on page, whatever. You should be able to find Shoftim pretty easily, right? And there's an explicit verse in the book of Judges that says, Vayilkedu Velkod Yehuda. And again, this is not a political statement at all, but it does say that the tribe of Judah conquered Aza and Gvula, Ve'et Ashkelon ve'et Gvula, ve'et Ekron ve'et Gvula. In other words, all the cities that were all famous because they were all the Philistine cities, right? They were captured, right? And got, right? So all those cities were captured, right? The ones that we're going to meet again in the book, with King David when he, takes the Aron, and you remember the fish god falls down. You remember those stories. So here in a verse that we kind of threw away. This, in the book of Shoftim, we never really read chapter 1 of Shoftim anyway. But when we read it, all of a sudden we discovered that the tribe of Judah in the initial conquest conquered Ashkelon and Aza, and those all theoretically became part of the land of Israel. It says Tosfot, or says Rabbeinu Tam living in Germany, right? Of course he says, right? So how could that possibly be? Right? How could it possibly be that Ashkelon is not counted in Eretz Yisrael? Right? Shoftim chapter 1, verse 18. Right? And again, Joshua chapter 13 is the same thing. So V'omer Rabbeinu Tam. So first gambit says. So again, what we have is a conflict, right? On one hand, our Mishnah says that Ashkelon is not considered Eretz Yisrael, and certainly Aza, and Akko is also in that pasuk, if I'm not mistaken. No, Akko is not in that pasuk. No, Akko is in a later pasuk. Okay, we'll get to Akko in a few minutes. Akko is in a later pasuk, but it also says that I think 31 maybe. Right. Okay. So it says Asher Akko, but right, it goes all the way up north. Okay, we'll come back to Akko in a few minutes. It's true, says Rabbeinu Tam, that Akko was part of Eretz Yisrael, but then something else happened. We were exiled, and we were exiled. Don't Rabbeinu Tam, Dole Bavel Lo Kavshua. When they came back after the exile, then it wasn't captured by the returners from Babel in 536. In other words, Ezra's team, the land of Israel was much smaller, and it wasn't captured then. Okay, so two things here of note in this line of Tosfot. First of all, one, Tosfot uses a different language than the Rambam. Right, the Rambam uses the language of Chazaka, right? Tosfot uses the language of Lichbosh, to conquer. Right? Not whether you lived there, but actually just if you conquered. If you didn't live there, it wouldn't be so important for us. The second thing Tosfos is assuming is that once you didn't conquer in the second conquest, it doesn't have the Shem Eretz Yisrael. Right? You agree, right? That's much more basic to our discussion. Whereas the fact that it wasn't conquered, in words, it wasn't conquered, means that it doesn't have a Shem Eretz Yisrael. So really the Mishnah is right. Because we can live with the fact that Psukim say we conquered, that in the times of the judges, they conquered Ashkelon, and the Mishnah says it's not Eretz Yisrael because for the purposes of the name Eretz Yisrael, the definition of Eretz Yisrael, we go by the second conquest and not the first conquest. That's Tosfos' approach. Okay.
What about the third conquest?
Well, we haven't. Right, we'll have to see. Okay, well that'll come up in the Ramban. Okay, Kedar Perak Kulin. Tosfos then goes off on kind of an aside here. Kavei Beit Shan Harbe Krachim Kavshum Alei Mitzrayim V'lo Kavshum Alei Bavel. In other words, we have an example of Beit Shan there were many places, there were many environments that were conquered in the first conquest and not the second conquest. Then Tosfos adds a detail, which we're going to see again in the Ritva. Since it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, because it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, that's why there were no scholars there 600 years later when the Mishnah was written, right? And there were no Batei Din, or at least established Batei Din there, and therefore what? Right, exactly. Therefore, either they're not proficient in Lishma, or they're right. This is aware, or Eidim Mitzuyim L'Kaimer, right? There aren't Eidim to come along and say, and therefore you have to say Fanenechta. So Tosfos again says two things. One is that first he says this doesn't have a Shem Eretz Yisrael, right? Because Shem Eretz Yisrael is defined by the name, the definition of Eretz Yisrael for our purposes is defined by Kibush, and secondly, that manifests itself in the fact that there were no scholars there, right? One could have argued with Tosfos in either direction. You could say it is the Shem Eretz Yisrael, but still there are no scholars there. Or you could say, even if it doesn't have Shem Eretz Yisrael, there's still scholars there, and therefore we don't have to say Fanenechta. But Tosfos makes both those approaches. Which one has more weight? It's very hard to tell these at this point in Tosfos. Okay? It says Tosfos al Akashya. I'm just continuing Tosfos right now. I want to get to Akko, but I'm tempted to skip it, so I'll just read it quickly, okay? And if I don't explain every word, so we'll just manage. Okay? Vakasha says Tosfos. To Rekem v'Cheger, these other two places mentioned in the Mishnah, Mashma Hachadabu Chutz Laaretz. It also sounds like Rekem and Cheger are Chutz Laaretz. V'Ktiv Yoshua v'Yikachu Kadesh Har Naftali. Right? It says that V'Lekal Member the Lokav Shua Oloi Bavel. Right? It says they captured Kadesh and Har Naftali. That's seemingly the same thing as Rekem and Cheger, even though it's not the exact same name. And you can't say, like I just wanted to say a minute ago, that the second conquest didn't conquer them. To proceed free, Parshat Vayak Ekev Chashiv Rekem v'Cheger b'Hadei Krachim Shekav Shua Oloi Bavel. In the Sifri, it counts Rekem and Cheger among the cities that were conquered in the second conquest. So he says, here we have clear black on white evidence that these places were conquered. So how come they're not considered Eretz Yisrael? So it says Tosfos, and this is what Tosfos is going to do. Tosfos gives what's called a Mitziuti answer, right? He gives a practical answer, not a Svar answer. Fish Lomar, right? This is what there's two Rekem and Chegers, right? I know they say there's two Yosef Ben Shimon, there's two whatevers, right? There's Yesh Lomar the Trey Rekem and Cheger Havu. Shiur, the one that was written by Avraham, that it says Kadesh, which is the same thing as Rekem. Ben Rekem or Ben Chagra, right? Kadesh is Rekem. This line, by the way, I'm relatively certain just in terms of Tosfos. This line I think should have been earlier in Tosfos. Okay, it was just put out of place. Because Tosfos basically wants to say Kadesh is the same thing as Rekem. He should have told us the definition of Kadesh is Rekem earlier in the Tosfos. Okay, so I think he got a little mixed up here, but that's just my personal theory, right? But anyway, that's the thing, okay? Right? It's Rekem, there was one Rekem in Plishtim, right down in the south. And that actually was in Eretz Yisrael, not Abraham conquered. And that's the one that the Sifri counts as part of Eretz Yisrael. Right? I start off with the assumption that Avram Yitzchak lived in Israel. And it sounds like also in the book of Joshua, the one they conquered was in the Philistine area, which is in Eretz Yisrael. Right, that was in the west. The Plishtim Marav the Yam Plishtim Uvu Marav Eretz Yisrael. Plishtim was in the south. But Rekem v'Cheger, the Manitin, the Rekem v'Cheger that's mentioned in the Mishnah in Gittin, it says that's not Eretz Yisrael. Oh, that's in Israel. I mean, Rekem can be Israel. That's in the east, not in the west. So Tosfos has basically differentiated between two Rekem and Cheger in one place, Rekem and Cheger in the other place, right? And that's how he's able to. So to be perfectly honest, he's not able to resolve the contradiction, right? He's not able to. So he basically just creates a new space called Rekem and Cheger 1 and Rekem and Cheger 2. Okay. Now we go to Va'ako. Now Tosfos is asking a much more fundamental question. Va'ako, much more interesting for us, and not only, by the way, for those who are watching online because it's underlined. Va'ako. What about Akko? Tosfos started off with the assumption that these places weren't right, that Ashkelon was not conquered in the second conquest, and that's why it's not Eretz Yisrael. So what about Akko? Akko was clearly conquered in the second conquest, right? There's a new museum in Akko. You can go see the whole history of it, right? It's really awesome if you can get there right now. Okay, so you can get there now. It's still safe. So remember so it says Tosfot, I know that Akko was conquered in the second conquest. Why? Because we have two Gemaras. One, Rabbi Abba Haya Menashek Kipe de Akko. Rabbi Abba was like those Jews getting off the El Al plains in the early 1970s. He would kiss the stones of Akko, right? He would kiss the stones of Akko. So it must be that it has Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, right? I assume. So if it, right, Tosfos says, and if it has Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, it must have been conquered in the second conquest. So why? So then again, we've set up a contradiction. Michael, you understand, right? How could it be that our Mishnah says Akko is not Eretz Yisrael, right? Rabbi Abba, Menashe Kipe de Akko, Ubeperk Misha Achzo. Not only that, that was question number 6 that I asked a few minutes ago about, or space number 6, where we have to define Eretz Yisrael. And we have another Gemara in our in Masachet Gittin, Parach Lememra, Da'ako Lav Eretz Yisrael Hava. You're going to suggest that Akko is not Eretz Yisrael? Ha Ki Havu Mifteri Rabbanan Mi'adadi. When the rabbis would say goodbye, you remember that throughout the Amoraic period and even the Tannaitic period, but we're certainly more in the Amoraic period, rabbis used to travel between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, and they would wish the rabbis goodbye. The rabbis would walk them to Akko. Ki Havu Mifteri Rabbanan. That doesn't mean when they die. That means when they went to say goodbye to each other, me'adadi from each other. Be'akko have a mifteri me'adadi. And Tosfos assumes why. Why would they go to Akko and they wouldn't take a step behind it? Because issue number 5. Because we have another Gemara that says, Dasur, I lost the place. Okay? So here Tosfos has already set up not just, hey, I believe the second conquest is significant, and Ashkelon wasn't in the right words. Ashkelon wasn't the second conquest, and then he said, "Oh, Rekem and Chegir, we have 2 Rekem and Chegir." Right? So he differentiates between Rekem and Chegir. Here we have competing halachot, right? So before we get to Tosfos' answer, where Tosfos also throws in the towel, right? It's no. Right, you can read the next line. Tosfos also throws in the towel. What do I mean he throws in the towel? You understand? He says, "Oh, just like there were 2 Rekem and Chegirs, there were 2 Akkos, right? Or Akko was split in half. That's what we call punting, right? That's what we have no right. You're stuck, right? What could you answer? Before we get to this, what could you answer?
Status?
What do you mean?
Some other time? I don't know.
In other words, again, the question we have in front of us is our Mishnah declares Akko out of Eretz Yisrael. And he has 2 Gemaras here. One, that they would kiss the ground and they would kiss the stones. Keep it. One second. They would kiss the stones, just finish that. They would kiss the stones, and 2, when the rabbis would say goodbye, they wouldn't go past Akko. They couldn't leave Eretz Yisrael. What's the much better way to go, especially if you're a Lamdan? What do you want to say?
Didn't have all the Jews.
No, you're already giving an answer. There's a much easier way to go, which is to basically say, who says that there's different definitions of what Eretz Yisrael is. For it's the definition of Eretz Yisrael for the purposes of leaving Eretz Yisrael, or for the purposes of kissing kissing is not an halacha, right? That's one definition of Eretz Yisrael, and there's another definition for the purposes of Gittin, or for the purposes of Truma Maisra. Right? On what basis would you make such a distinction? What would be the way to formulate?
Operating.
So right. Some things you might need a Beit Din for, right? And what do you need? And what's this about? What are these halachot about? About you're not allowed to leave, or you're not allowed to. So they're already, I don't know, kedusha. Maybe it's about the kedusha. So here the rabbis are going to introduce a very interesting term. The Rishonim are going to introduce an interesting term. They're going to say, this is not shame. This is the way the Rav defined it, right? The Rav said, when you talk about Eretz Yisrael, you could talk about, and then this is what we're going to play with for the next session and a half, right? We can talk about the Shem Eretz Yisrael, or the halachic definition of Shem Eretz Yisrael, which generally involves Kedusha, but not only. And then we can talk about the Chibat Eretz Yisrael, right? There are places where we love because it has the aura of Eretz Yisrael. We want to give Jews around the world this sense of the dynamism and the excitement surrounding Eretz Yisrael. Right? So it could be, it's theoretically possible, and we'll see this in a few minutes, that the Chibat Eretz Yisrael, the definitions are different. Right? For Chibat Eretz Yisrael, I don't necessarily need, it doesn't only have to be more expansive geographically. Sometimes it could be, right? Sometimes it could be even less expansive. I'm going to show you a shita like that. It could be even more mitzumtzam. But to get a Shem Eretz Yisrael, you might need, I don't know, things like, maybe you could think about kibush, chazaka, or it's, though you're more, right, no, it's the formal definitions might require some sort of big picture, formal, national something, Whereas the chibat Eretz Yisrael, that might be much more, I don't know, like emotional, individual, subjective. You wouldn't necessarily require a kibush, or maybe you could differentiate. You could say, oh, kibush, that gets you to A. Chazaka, that gets you to B. Right? You understand? In other words, when you're living there, and maybe the opposite, you could say chazaka. Once you're living there, maybe we need less of chibat Eretz Yisrael. Right? You understand? Chibat, if you say chibat Eretz Yisrael, which we want to generate this emotional attachment for Jews, so maybe we'll say when we're living there, then we don't need it. When we're not living there, then we need it. You could make such an argument in theory.
The distinction between these items of like kissing the ground or leaving versus, let's say, Gittin or even declaring the festivals, is that because they either one might not need a Beit Din, and could it be that the rule of a Beit Din?
Oh, so that's what Danny said. Danny said maybe the Beit Din is also part of this discussion. And again, Beit Din shouldn't have anything to do with Chiba. I agree. Things you need a Beit Din for, right? So Tosfot again, that comes back to how much weight in the first line of Tosfot do you give the first part of Tosfot or the second part of Tosfot? What the Rabbeinu Tam, right? You remember Rabbeinu Tam said two things. He said, well, there wasn't, right? They didn't conquer Ashkelon the second time, and because of that, there was no Beit Din there. Right? Tosfos could have equally just said there was no Beit Din there. Right? They conquered it. I don't care if they conquered it. So it says they didn't conquer it because so you have to think about that. Again, there's not enough evidence yet so far to be able to say which one it is. Right? Tosfos says both of those things. We'll see in some of the Rishonim, some accentuate the first one, some of them accentuate the second one. So this is actually a very important Tosfos. And this line is super important. It's very interesting because of where Tosfos goes with it. So again, what we're up to right now in the Tosfos, just to summarize. What Tosfos has done yet so far is Tosfos raised the issue of Ashkelon. He said, hey, there's psukim in the Torah, in the Navi, that seem to indicate that Ashkelon was part of Eretz Yisrael. So Tosfot said, okay, regarding Ashkelon, I'll throw in the right. I'm willing to play that game because Ashkelon it was in the first conquest and not the second conquest, and because it's the second conquest, therefore there was no Batei Din there, and therefore it's out. It's chutzlar. It's forgiven. What about Rekem and Cheger? There's psukim that indicate that Rekem and Cheger, assuming that Rekem and Cheger is Kadesh of Naphtali, so that was also part of Eretz Yisrael. Tosfos says there already Tosfos is a little more strong, right? He's got a little more problems because there already it meets his definition. Mm-hmm. By the way, in terms of the Batei Din, no. And here Tosfos seems to be giving much more credence when he talks about Rekem and Cheger to the first part of his argument that it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, because he says, hey, here it was conquered in the second conquest. Right? He doesn't mention the issue of the Batei Din. Right? You understand when it comes to the discussion of Rekem and Cheger. So the second part of Tosfos, he says Rekem and Cheger. There he's really up against the wall. Rekem and Cheger, if assuming Rekem and Cheger is Kadesh Naphtali, Kadesh, so then why the heck is it considered Chutz La'aretz in the Mishnah? It says Tosfos. There's two Rekem and Chegers. There's one in the Plishtim in the west, in the southwest, and there's another Rekem in the east, and that's what it says in the Mishnah. Rekem is considered to the east, and he brings proofs to that. Then he says, what about Akko? After all, Akko was also conquered, and not only was Akko and it was conquered in the second conquest. And nonetheless, says Tosfot, this is where we're up to now. In the third part of Tosfot, when he talks about Akko, so again, we have the Ashkelon part, the Rekem and Cheger part, and the Akko part. And right in the Akko part, says Tosfot, hey, how come rabbis kiss the stones? And you remember Danny from Bava Metzia, Kippei de Rabbi Nachman. Do you remember that? Does that sound familiar? I told you, yeah. That's like the fourth most famous thing after she would right, where it's whatever Pruta de Rabbi Yosef, whatever. That's one of our favorite ones. It's just instead of jewels, like there was some rebid. It went up in value, whatever. That's like a thing. That's the word kippei we always talk about. Okay, so kippei da'ako. So the Gemara later on says, is Akko not Eretz Yisrael? And the Gemara brings up one thing, and then Tosfos brings up another thing. Number one, Rabbi Abba used to kiss the stones of Akko, and two, the rabbis would say goodbye in Akko. So what does Rabbeinu Tam say? How does he deal with that? How come our Mishnah considered it chutz la'aretz if they would kiss the stones or say goodbye there? Says Rabbeinu Tam, hey, I'll tell you what, Omer Rabbeinu Tam. You see, Rabbeinu Tam was totally obsessed with this, right? The lo kasha midi, the Akko, haita. So he's not going to say there were two Akkos. That's a little hard to say. So he says, I'll one up you on the two Akko, on the two Rekem and Chegers. I'll say Akko was Berlin, right? Akko chetzia be'aretz, v'chetzia b'chutz la'aretz. Whereas there was half. It was half and half, right? Our Mishnah in Gittin that says Akko was chutz la'aretz, Mari b'shat sheb'chutz la'aretz. Okay. Okay, I want to skip the next part just because it's really not so relevant to us. It's not going to be part of our discussion. Okay, at the end, the next part of Tosfos is kasha l'ri. So now Rabbeinu Tam's cousin gets involved, and he says, "Wait, I'm not so convinced about my cousin's argument." The Gemara is going to say this. We'll get to hopefully. Nichlas lefan of Rabbi Lai, Amrle, hello, Kfar Sisai. He raised this place, this seaside village. Again, those of you who want to go figure out where these places are invited to. Muvla betchum Eretz Yisrael v'krovalet Tzipori yoter miyako. So Sisai is closer to Tzipori from Akko. We all know where these places are. Umabekach b'kol makom Akko adifa. Afal pi shehi rechoka mitzipora shehi atzma chetz yam Eretz Yisrael. Or it says Tosfot, Kfar Sisai is. The Gemara says one is closer to Israel than the other one. It says three, but Akko has a leg up on Kfar Sisai because it's half Eretz Yisrael at least. Okay. Whereas Sisai is not. It's I know it's closer, but it's not. The whole city is seemingly not Eretz Yisrael, right? That's what the Gemara says. One sec. Okay, just skip down to the Re's answer because that's what I'm. The Re's answer. Romer Re. The afilu, he says, I'm willing to grant you that Akko was split into two, but he says an interesting shita here. The afilu b'tzad shel Eretz Yisrael tzarich lomar b'fanei nechtam b'fanei nechtam. Lefishu b'sof hagvul v'rachok mi'ikar yishuv Eretz Yisrael u'muflag min ha'yeshivot u'batei dinim v'chein yesh letaretz l'gabe Ashkelon. So what does the Re say? Unlike Rabbeinu Tam, he says that even though I acknowledge that there might be two sides of Akko, and Akko is Chutz La'aretz, right? And he said, even though it's Berlin, West Berlin, and East Berlin, but he said, even on the West Berlin side, i.e. the Eretz Yisrael side, you still have to say B'fanei Nechta.
Okay.
And that's important to us. That's very tantalizing for me. Whereas it could have the Shem Eretz Yisrael, right? And yet still,
but that's because we said that maybe these two laws are not linked to each other.
Right, correct. No, but this is the first one to say it in black on white. In other words, he says it could be the fact that it's half and half might be enough to say that's why they said goodbye because they didn't want to go to Chutz La'aretz. But even in the half that's in Eretz Yisrael, it's not going to be enough. Forget, right? Because it's far away, and Batei and the Muflag Min Yeshiva, it's far away from the Yeshiva to Batei Din, whereas there were no Batei Din there. So in other words, here already we're trying to in other words. If until now, when I started today, I said, "Oh, this doesn't make any sense. Why would I care about Eretz Yisrael, right? I should care about whether they're Batei Din." So here the Re says it explicitly, which it doesn't have anything to do with this. So Rabbeinu Tam seems to be there seems to be a basic distinction here, a discussion between Rabbeinu Tam and the Re here about without again I don't want to get bogged down too much in the details, but there seems to be a fundamental discussion. Rabbeinu Tam is really pushing the line. I need this to be in Eretz Yisrael. Right, I need Akko to be in Eretz Yisrael because Akko is going to be in Chutz La'aretz. We have all these other places we have all these other indications. They kissed, they land, etc. They said goodbye. Oh, Akko was split into two. But ostensibly, Rabbeinu Tam would say what? Then in the part that's Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam. The Re, because he's stuck with this other Gemara that about Kfar Sisai, seems to already throw in the towel there. And he said, no. Even though it is Eretz Yisrael, right? Very interesting. Even though it is Eretz Yisrael, you're still going to have to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam, because there's no Batei Din there. Or to put it in other terms, if we saw Rabbeinu Tam at the beginning had those two things, he said, right? In other words, there wasn't the kibush, right? There wasn't the kibush, and because of that, there was no, right? It wasn't conquered in the second conquest. His initial gambit, it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, and therefore there was no Batei Din. And I said, maybe which one is it? Here, the Re basically says what's really important is the second issue: are there Batei Din or not? If there are rabbinical courts there, then you don't have to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam. If there aren't, then you have to say B'fanei Nechtam. I don't care if it's in Eretz Yisrael.
What about the rabbinical courts in New York or events?
Right. So that's a good question, right? In other words, what if you know that they know Lishma? But here the rabbis made a distinction. They said, we don't care.
From a logical perspective, if there are Batei Din in the city, you have to say this, right? Because the city itself would only have one beit, right? So if
what Akko
Israel part was out, right? It's still the same beit.
No, but he says there aren't. He says there aren't. Right. His assumption is there aren't Batei Din in Chutz La'aretz.
To say that though,
right?
It's illogical to say there's a beit in there,
right?
Because the city is half here and half there. They're not the team,
right? Okay.
The same beit.
So Rabbeinu Tam's argument is complicated. And as I said, he's kind of throwing in the towel a little, Rabbeinu Tam. We'll come back to the read to discuss it a little more. But the person who kind of takes apart Rabbeinu Tam's argument completely is the Ramban. And Rabbi Rosenzweig introduced this by saying, I love the way he said, you'd expect the person to take apart being the Ramban and the Ramban. I love that formulation. He said, why? He said, first of all, because the Ramban, of course, didn't like these kind of arguments so much because he was intellectually, very, on the ball, but also because the Ramban himself was the Mr. Eretz Yisrael man, right? In other words, we know that he made Aliyah himself. He has these beautiful letters about him. We know that he's the one who criticizes Abraham for leaving Eretz Yisrael, and we know that he's the one who, right, without God's intention, we know he's the one who
He flies that plane.
Right? No, it's and just about anytime he can, he speaks about, right, and he counts, well, that's what we're going to see. He's the one who counts living in Israel as a mitzvah, right? So it's hard for us to imagine that that Rabbeinu Tam's argument that it's all very, very technical, and whether kibush yachid, whether the second kibush wasn't a kibush at all, in other words, that it doesn't count for Eretz Yisrael anymore if it wasn't conquered. What do you mean? Israel has omni-significance.
Right.
Who cares if they lived there, or the Rambam's formulation, if they were machzik there? What do you mean? Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael. This place has kedusha. Whereas the real Gemara, so to speak, is the guys who kissed the land because they knew, right? But they were exactly. So this manifests itself most, right? And therefore he has to come up with another explanation. How can it possibly be that Akko or Ashkelon are not going to be Eretz Yisrael? What do you mean? Right? So again, just to remind you, this is the Frankel edition of the Sefer HaMitzvot. The Rambam, in addition to writing the Mishnah Torah and the Guide to the Perplexed, just wrote like other Rishonim, wrote an enumeration of the mitzvot, like the Sefer HaChinuch. And the Ramban, right, who was living, still then in Barcelona, right? Remember, the Rambam dies in 1204, right? So the books get to the Ramban. Ramban is born 1180, so the books get to the Ramban after the Rambam. He's basically doing most of his writing after the Rambam is already dead. Okay, but he has. You'll remember in the Sefer HaMitzvot, he has comment. The Rambam wrote a 14-chapter introduction to why he lists certain mitzvot and why he doesn't. The Ramban wrote a whole treatise responding to that. And then he wrote comments on some of the mitzvot. He said some of these don't need to include, some of them. When he knocked out mitzvot of the Rambam, then he had to make it up to the 613. Why he had to make it up to the 613 is a big thing, because I don't know how much 500 years before the Rambam, the number 613 was not as important as it became after the Rambam. Okay, or after, let's say, the 11th century. But in the 11th, 12th century, that's when they started counting mitzvot. That's when they got them in 613, right? It's not like today when we grew up and they said, "Oh, I'm going to aspire as much as I can to do all 613 commandments." It's not possible. Okay, but right, it's not possible to do that. You have to be a Kohen Gadol. You have to be, it's like not so simple. But right, exactly. It's not so simple to do all those things at once. It would require a certain. But anyway, the 613 became a big thing. But the Ramban takes out certain mitzvot, and therefore he has to add certain mitzvot, right? Like the famous one, like he says, lending to a goy beribit is a mitzvah, right? That's like the famous one. So probably the most famous one in our generation is the one that is mitzvah number 4. The Ramban adds. I think he takes out 16 or 17 mitzvot of the Rambam, the Assays, and he has to add 16. And one of them he adds is mitzvot Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which the Rambam didn't count, right? Now, why the Rambam didn't count it, that's, when we were like in yeshiva, that was like the big discussion, that's how there were books and treatises written about why the Rambam didn't count it. Did he really mean it? And whatever, was it a general mitzvah, etc. But in the discussion, in the Ramban's discussion, that's what and more articulated by the Ritva in an attempt to answer Tosfos' question. So the Ramban also takes issue with Tosfos, with the Rabbeinu Tam's distinction here about the second conquest and whether that would qualify as Eretz Yisrael or not. And therefore, and if he doesn't, then he has to address our Mishnah, which is why does our Mishnah not count this as Eretz Yisrael? Right? He's going to have to address that question. So we're going to read it through quickly. See if I can get to the main part. Yeah. Okay. What I want to get to here in the main part is the way the Ramban relates in his commentary or his list of mitzvot, the way he relates to Rabbi Abba, where it's the rabbis who said goodbye and the rabbis and how much valence he gives to that, because that's actually important. To the extent to which you give that importance, so then you're really going to have a challenge on your hands for our mission, right? So just very, very quickly, the Ramban says, then we'll see in the Ritva a little more clearly in terms of addressing our question. So the Ramban says, again, in my Sefer HaMitzvot, this is like the way it looks, or just at the end, it's called the Shichachat Ha'asin Ledat HaRamban. The Ramban's vision of the mitzvot that were right, the lost mitzvot of the Rambam, right? The ones he forgot, right? Because and again, he's what's the word? He's taken out. What's the word? Expunged, right? A certain amount of mitzvot from the Rambam. Okay, so mitzvah Revi'it is Tavanu LaReshat Haaretz Asher Natan Ha'Elit Barach. We have a mitzvah to inherit the land. Asher Natan Ha'Elit Barach v'Yitalel Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov. V'lo ne'azva. We shouldn't abandon either. Biyad zulatin. We shouldn't give it to anybody else. Amot or lishmama. We shouldn't give it to anybody else, or just leave it abandoned. Right? If you leave a house in Eretz Yisrael, you violated a positive commandment, according to the Rambam. And that's where it says, "Hu amar lahem, or rashtem etartz yeshavtem ba." That's the pasuk. Inherit the land, dwell in it. Ki lachem natati et haaretz azershtrota, v'nachaltem et haaretz. You have to live in the land. V'nichbal b'zen yan mitzvah azov mekomot acherim. It says it a number of times, like in chapter 1 of Dvarim, Bo rishu et haaretz shenishmat lavotechem, u'per lahem mitzvah azot kula b'gvuleha u'mitzareha. And the Torah actually goes through the details of the gvulot and its dimensions. It says, go down to the river, etc. When we get to Daf Zayin, maybe we'll talk about how we could deal with Ashkelon not being in Eretz Yisrael if it says go to the beach. But okay. You shouldn't leave any places empty. This is interesting in and of itself. He says one of the proofs is in the Meraglim, where it says, I just lost the place here. Alei reish kasher diber Hashem Elokecha al tirav al techad. Right? In other words, God tells the Meraglim, at least in the Dvarim version, go inherit the land. Ramar Od says it also in chapter 9. When God sent you out from Kadesh Barnea, Alu rishu et haaretz shenatati lachem ukasher lo avu lalot, when they didn't want to go up, when the Torah says that the Jews didn't want to go inherit the land and the Meraglim didn't want to go, it says Vatamru et bi Hashem. They rebelled. That was considered a rebellion. So if it's considered a rebellion, it must be a positive commandment. So claims the Ramban. Right? You could argue. You don't have to necessarily agree with that argument. That could be just that was considered a rebellion because there was a direct command. But okay. This is a proof that this was not just some sort of promise, but it was actually a directive. Directive, alo resh, go inherit the land. So all of us who are sitting here in Eretz Yisrael, you can feel good. You can fulfill this mitzvah if you made aliyah. Okay? Sorry. And that's what the rabbis call a mechamed mitzvah. Right? You want to know what a mechamed mitzvah is? A mechamed mitzvah is going to inherit the land. Okay, I'm moving Gemara. Sota, Rav Yehuda, mechamed Yoshua lechabesh, divrei hakol or lichbosh. Right? The conquest of Joshua, the first conquest, which was to conquer the land, divrei hakol chova. Mechamed David laharvacha, divrei hakol reshut. So Joshua's first conquest, that was an obligation. King David's conquest of the lands in Syria, etc., that was all an optional mitzvah. Lashon sifri, but not a mitzvah, right? But the first one was, again, chova is the equivalent of a mitzvah for the Ramban. Lashon sifri, the sifri says in Shofti, if you're able to conquer the land, you will be able to live in the land. Don't think the mitzvah is only to fight the 7 nations, where we have to kill them. That is not the case. We were allowed to we can kill them, we can make peace with them, that doesn't make a difference. Even if you want to make peace, but the land, that you have to absolutely take yourself. You have to always have the land in your hands. Okay, now we get to the part that's important to us. And that's just like your big Zionist speech for today. You should feel good. Okay. Sorry, one more part. Even if the enemy nations run away from us, the Girgashi ran away. Right? And the Gemara says that God gave them Africa, the Girgashi. It doesn't make a difference. If they ran away, right? Don't think it's only about conquest. We have a responsibility to settle the land. Settling is super important, right? This was hard for the right wing. The Rambam's ignoring of this mitzvah was hard for the right wing, religious Zionists, and this Ramban became a kind of like a centerpiece of their discussion, right? It's not enough. Even if they leave, we have to conquer. we have to take over. We have to live there. And for people like more in the center and to the left, this text becomes, somewhat difficult. Like at what point, at what point do you do this? And the simple answer is it can't all be done at once. That's the simple answer. Okay. After we get rid of the nations, and if once they leave, you're not allowed to go conquer their lands. You can't just do that. You were obligated to live here. So again, unlike the Rambam who talks about chazaka, the mitzvah is kibush. Okay, I'm continuing. Wherever you walk, that's yours. Right? Amar lahem kol makom shetichbeshu chutz min hamakomot ha'elu hariu shalachem or reshut bi'achem lichbosh chutz laaretz ad o reshut bi'adam lichbosh chutz laaretz ad shelo yichboshu eretz Yisrael Talmud lamar v'yirshtem begoyim gdolim v'atzuim v'achar kach kol makom asher tidroch kav lachem. Whereas you're only allowed to conquer those places outside the land once you conquer the places in the land and you're living in them. V'amru. My computer is gonna pass out in a few minutes. Let's see if I can plug it. Okay, I'm going to try to. I thought you got to the point that I wanted to get to earlier. Okay. This works. Yeah. Okay. Fine. No, I'm good. I'm good. Okay. Okay. Skip down a couple of lines there. Vomerani. See, I skipped like 4 lines down. The mitzvah of living in the land of Israel. Anybody who leaves land and lives in Chutz Laaretz, right? Anybody who lives overseas should be considered like an idol worshiper. Right? The Torah says, if you, when God talks about the exile, he says, I kicked you out, and now you're going to go worship other idols, right? Or other gods, I should say. When the rabbi said those kinds of things, we should look at someone who lives in the Chutz Laaretz, like Avodah Barazar. It's all part of this mitzvah. Im kain hi mitzvat aseh ledorot mitchayev kol yachid mimenu v'afilu bizman galut, even when you're living in exile. Okay, what is the Ramban basically saying? That Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael, even if we're completely in exile, right? This is not like the Rambam or the Tosfot. Eretz Yisrael hasn't lost its luster just because we're living in Galut. Whatever. They got to the environs or the outside of Eretz Yisrael, and they started crying. So again, the point is, he takes Chibat Eretz Yisrael and he says that is not independent of the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. The Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, it seemingly is always in play, right? In other words, that's what he seems to say. And again, that manifests itself particularly in the way the Ritva plays it out in this sugya. In other words, the Ritva is playing off the Ramban, I think. And he says, right, when he asked the same question that Tosfot does, right? This is in the next line of the Ritva, right? The Kashalan this is the end of the first line. I don't know if you have it there. Mashkelon, Daram, Mashkelon, Kedaram, Yaakov, Safman, Safon. Says the Ritva, the Kashalan, Da'ako, Meretz Yisrael, Ashkelon, Gah. How the heck can you tell me that Ashkelon and Akko are Chutz Laaretz, right? The same question as Tosfot, right? But he's going to come to a different conclusion than Tosfot, right? Wherever it says that, the Lo Horish, Mashma Eretz Yisrael Ninu, right? It says they didn't conquer Akko, right? So no, one of those would say they didn't conquer Akko, so it's not Eretz Yisrael. It says the river, they didn't conquer Akko. That means they didn't conquer it, but it's still Israel. Understand? In words, it's Omni, it's Kedushas forever. What do you mean? Right? Okay. So says the Ritva. First, he starts off like Tosfot. I think this is Tosfot. Before you can see where I haven't underlined is he has another explanation. He's going to have 2 or 3 answers to this question. Okay, so they wasn't done in the second conquest. Okay, that's the first answer of Tos. That's Rabbeinu Tam. That's straight Rabbeinu Tam, straight up, right? That it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, and therefore, the Kevan Shalonich Bashu. Sorry. Lefichach the Inyan Gittin, right? No, here what Tosa didn't say explicitly, the Ritva says explicitly, and therefore regarding Gittin, or Chas v'Shalom, it wouldn't lose its Eretz Yisrael status. It does Pishas Eretz Yisrael, even if we're not there, right? You with me? But regarding Gittin, because it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, no, those two words, Lein and Gittin, don't appear in the Tosfot, as far as I remember. Right? You understand? You see the difference? Tosfot says it's not that. Remember, I asked in Rabbeinu Tam, which is the important part? That it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, or that there weren't Batei Din there? The Ritva takes a sign on that thing. He says, because it wasn't conquered in the second conquest, therefore there was no Batei Din there. Oh, there was no Batei Din there, and you have to say Vananechta, Vananechta. In other words, it could have the Shem Eretz Yisrael, but it doesn't have, regarding Gittin, we're going to, leave it out. Right? The Kevan Shalonich Bashu Shenit, Lo Havi Batei Din Fuim Sham, Ve'enedi Mitzuyim Lakaimo. Right there, he already quotes our, Rava, sorry, right? It's not, right? It's not the Shema, it's Eidim Mitzuyim Lakaimo. The Dineim Kechutz La'aretz the Gemura, right? It's not Chutz La'aretz, it's just Din is like Chutz La'aretz. Right, you follow?
So we end up what they did or not.
Correct. And you have to say Vananechta. Again, maybe. He doesn't say it like that. He says since it wasn't conquered, there were no Batei Din. Right. In other words, the Batei Din were never set up here. There was never a sphere of the Batei Din. Maybe you'll tell me Hatinach Ashkelon. Okay, so Ashkelon wasn't reconquered in the second conquest, and because of that, there were no Batei Din there. But Akko, this is again in Tosfot. Akko certainly was in the second conquest, because after all, Rabbi Abba was Menashe keeping the Akko. He would kiss the stones of Akko. Right, so it does sound like it was Kadosh. If you look up Shua, lo Aita Kedosha. Whereas we pass in that Joshua's Kedusha might have expired, but the second Kedusha doesn't expire. Again, how this fits into what he said before, I'm not 100% sure. But somehow he says that even if we say Joshua's Kedusha expired, the fact that they were kissing the stones indicates that it was Kadosh. And if it was indicating, kissing the stones means that it was Kadosh, so then what are you going to say? What?
So he's saying it had to have been reconquered.
Right, it had to have been reconquered, correct. So now here he says the important part. This is where we'll stop for today, and then next week we'll spend a little more time on this. V'yesh lefarish. This is already where the Ramban comes in, and the Ritva says it explicitly. He says this isn't the unique halacha in Gittin. There were no Batei Din there. It's some technical mumbo jumbo that we can't have Eidim Mitzuyim L'Kammo. He says no. There's two dinim. There's two different things. V'yesh lefarish, says the Ritva. Temishum halo ira. Don't start asking me questions about Akko. Not because there were two Akkos. Right? Don't tell me there were two Akkos, or Akko was, forget about two Akkos, sorry, Akko was split in half. No. He says, one second. Something just happened to my sheet. I can't see it. Okay, he says, the Efshar, the Lokav Shua. Really, Akko was never reconquered in the second conquest. Now I'm finally happy. Right? It wasn't conquered in the second conquest. And nonetheless, even though it doesn't have a Shem Eretz Yisrael, in other words, it's not Eretz Yisrael. It was but still what? Right. Afal Pichen, right? Shabbat Kushata, Chibat Haaretz Lo Bak. And here he hasn't said yet so far that there's two Akkos. He says there's one Akko, it wasn't conquered, it wasn't reconquered, but the Ramban's omnisignificance, right, which doesn't give a Kedusha, but it means we have to love Eretz Yisrael, right? We have a mitzvah always to conquer it. That's enough to make us want to kiss the land. De'i lo temach. If we don't say that, Lamanda Amar and Yavamot, the Kedusha Rishona, Vishnia, the Shlishit. Here we go already. Michael, your Kedusha Shlishit. Yeshlahem Kedusha Dina Yeshlahem. Words. These places will have Kedusha Rishona and Shnia and Shlishit. The Kedusha Shnia Kitchel Shaita Velo Kitchalati Lavo. Right? In other words, the second conquest also expired at some point. Achshav sha'aretz chareva. Listen to this line. This is great. This is where we'll stop. Now, again, 13th century, 12th century Spain. Now that the land is granted, since the second conquest was canceled because we went into exile, could you possibly say that we don't love Eretz Yisrael just because we're exiled? If you believe that the second conquest Kedusha was canceled, couldn't possibly be. It's inconceivable that we could stop loving Eretz Yisrael. Ella havada enunira. Right? Then he makes one suggestion. I just want to give me one more second. Maybe you could differentiate and say now that we're living in Spain in the 13th century, yeah, we have chiba, but we don't have kedusha. Aval b'kibush sheni, after the second conquest, when they were still living in Israel, kevan demiktzat haaretz kfusha, since half the land was conquered, he doesn't talk about half the city, but half the land was conquered. V'hikdosha mashalo kivshu, v'hikdosha mashalo kivshu, sheino kadosh batel namichibato, sheino chaviv ela hakadosh. This is a totally fascinating suggestion. What does he suggest? He says, maybe, okay, right, no, he says, if the second conquest, while the second conquest was in play, then there was no chiba. Because you had a place that there was kadosh. But once, assuming that the second conquest was undid the kedusha, right, it was we moved to Spain, then the chiba kicks in again. That's very fascinating. Whereas there's somehow you need to have some connection to the land. So the connection can be manifest in one of two ways. Right. If it's kadosh, if we're living there, or it's after the second conquest, when we're living in the land of Israel, then there's no need to have, even in places which haven't been conquered yet, there's no need for the chiba. But once you're in total exile and there's no kedusha there, it's Israel. Right. That's a very fascinating suggestion. Once you're right, or maybe what you said a different formulation. Yeah, we need to think about this. That's a very interesting suggestion. Right, it says but now in our sins, when we're not kadosh klal, it would be inconceivable to say there's no chiba at all. Again, what you see in the Shiur, we'll start with this next week. Just let's actually, you see the Ramban's aura in the background here. That the land of Israel has some sort of, honestly, you need to have some sort of connection to it all the time. And therefore, he's not open to the suggestion that, right, that half and half, or it's all these technical suggestions that Tosfos seemingly takes for granted. Okay, so we've begun the discussion of Eretz Yisrael. What I want to do next week, I want to think about a little more this Ritva, and then there's one more line in the Ritva that's very important for me. And then I want to kind of play it out in different areas. Okay, so he was willing to, like the entertain the notion of Gittin being different. What about some of the other areas? What would we say about Kiddush HaChodesh? Or I have a list of things here. Right, what was Kufchav? I don't remember. That's Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. Egla Rufa, giving smicha. Right, you remember the fight in the 15th century in Tzfat about giving smicha? You can only give smicha in the land of Israel. Yes, you can only give smicha in the land of Israel. What about these cities? Can you give smicha in these cities? That's a debate. Okay, so we'll talk about some of those and some of the Rishonim. Okay. So I'm not sure. He says it explicitly. I'm not sure that he's the first one. I don't know. Right, exactly. I agree. No, it's Tosfos alludes to it, but he doesn't say the word. Right. Okay, we'll stop now. Okay, thank you. What do you want to say?
In the time where there's kedusha, there's a distinction between different parts of biblical Eretz Yisrael. This part's kadosh, this part isn't. Therefore, that's what we consider Eretz Yisrael. In the time when there's no kedusha, there's no distinction between Akko and Ranana or whatever it is. So therefore,
we're just going to have
to the whole biblical Eretz Yisrael.
Okay, that's interesting. That might be that's the opposite, I think, to some extent of what the Ritva is saying. But okay,
thank you.
It's the same.
It's a justification. Why would we say that?
I see, because we're not there. Okay, could be. Right, did I not tape this or I didn't? No, I didn't.